I realised recently that I've been playing bass for 30 years, which seems completely ridiculous to me. But anyway, upon realising that, I began to think back to my earliest time as a bass player and back to the players and the albums that were most influential to me back then. So for a bit of fun, I thought I'd put together this video where I talk about my 10 most influential bass player albums. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of the 10 best bass albums or anything like that. This is just my personal list of 10 albums that were the most influential to me. So I'm going to talk about each one of these albums in a little bit of detail, maybe play a few examples of things that I enjoyed from them, and we'll take it from there. But please do let me know in the comments if you share any of these same influences. I'm sure you do. And if you have other albums that you want to mention, let's talk about that in the comments as well. Okay, let's dive in and check out the first album. Okay, so the first album that I have to talk about is this one. This is A Physical Presence by Level 42. This is a double live album that came out in 1985, although I think I discovered it in 1989. I wasn't a bass player when I discovered this. My friend and I were just in the local library looking for new music to check out, and I think my dad was already into Level 42 a little bit. He was listening to Running in the Family, and I kind of liked that, so I thought I'd maybe have a listen to some of their older stuff. And so I borrowed this on cassette from my local library back in 1989, and I was really struck with it. Even before I decided I wanted to play the bass, I just loved this album. It was just such an exciting piece of music to listen to. So this has got loads of great stuff on it. It's got all the hits that the band had at the time, like The Chinese Way, Sun Goes Down, Hot Water, Love Games, all that kind of stuff. But of course the bass playing throughout the entire album is just absolutely extraordinary. And I know a lot of people think of Mark as just being a bit of a slap machine, and there's plenty of that on here, don't get me wrong, but there's just tons of great fingerstyle grooves and chordal parts on here as well. So this was a real inspiration. And when I first started picking up the bass, obviously I wanted to try and play some of this stuff, but couldn't. That would come a little bit later on, but this was incredibly influential. Now, any bass player that grew up in the 80s and was into Mark King would probably have tried to get their hands on one of these at some point, which is a JD bass, and I was fortunate enough to get hold of this one a few years back. This is a JD Supernatural, the kind of thing that Mark played back in the 80s. This is the salmon pink finish. This was inspired by the salmon pink JD that Mark used on the Level 42 Live at Wembley video, which I also really enjoyed. Really wanted a pink bass for some reason, and managed to get my hands on this one a few years ago. Anyway, going back to the A Physical Presence album, there was one particular song on there that really struck a chord with me, and it's the final song on the album. It's called 88, and it's an instrumental. And there's a thing that Mark plays at the very beginning, which is fairly simple, really. It's just this. It's just this 10th chord, open A string, and then the C sharp, so you get this major chord sound. And Mark uses these quite a lot in his playing, and I hadn't been playing bass for very long when I figured out this sound. And at the time I was beginning to learn a little bit about music theory as well, and I realised that what I was hearing there was a major chord. Anyway, figuring that out was a big step for me, and that led me into playing or learning the main riff of that song. So pleased when I figured out how to play that. That's actually a relatively straightforward riff to play by Mark King's standards, and I'm not suggesting that I was playing that in the early days of my bass playing, but that was one of the earliest things that I figured out of Mark's. And that song just had so much great stuff in it. You go from that into there's that great fingerstyle section in the middle, all that kind of great stuff, and then I think it goes into some chordal stuff as well. All that kind of stuff. I mean, for a young bass player who's just kind of checking out the instrument, that was just absolute gold. Such great stuff on that album. There's all the tune stuff as well in the live bass solo that he plays before Love Games. All this kind of and then there's that section from the Essential. And learning that and figuring it out, that really began to teach me about the basics of harmony, all that kind of open string tenth idea, the same thing as at the beginning of 88. You know, once I started to piece together some little bits of music theory, that became really quite something. I realised, you know, how Mark was beginning to outline harmony on the bass there, and that was absolutely fascinating for me. You know, back in 1990 or whatever it was when I first started working on tracks from this album. Okay, so Physical Presence, that was the first album that really influenced me. Let's check out the next album. The second album that was really important for me when I was starting out as a bass player was this one. This is Kings of Sleep by Stuart Hamm. This is his second album, came out in 1988 or 1989, I think. I think I discovered this back in 1991. So I'd already heard of Stu Hamm when I found this album. I'd been to my local music shop, which used to rent out tuition videos, and I'd found Stu's Slap, Pop and Tap for the bass video, which I'm sure many of you remember. My God, that video was like a complete godsend for me, because tuition resources back in the early 90s were really quite limited. There was just very little around if you wanted to learn slapping and tapping and things like that. So to find this video, it was just an absolute goldmine of just great technical playing and really, really interesting stuff for young bass players. So I was very, very inspired by that video. And then one day I was in Exeter, which is a city near where I live, and there's a shop there called Manson's Guitar Shop, which is still there. It's a fantastic shop. And I found this book, which is the Stu Hamm bass book, and I always consider myself to have been extremely lucky to have walked in on that day and found this book, because I've never seen this before or since in print. This appears to be long out of print, very, very difficult to get hold of, but it contains meticulously written transcriptions of loads of pieces from Stu's first 3 albums. So I knew the pieces that from this book from Stu's first album, which is called Radio Free Album Month, but I'd never heard of this Kings of Sleep album or The Urge. So back in 1991, if you wanted to hear an album that you couldn't get in the UK, you had to go and order it from a record shop. This shows how old I am. And I had to wait something like 3 weeks, 4 weeks for Kings of Sleep to turn up. But I remember hearing it and just being absolutely blown away by the bass playing. It was just all these, not just great bass playing, but great writing as well. The songs were fantastic, really great melodies, really good kind of upbeat rock songs, some really, really interesting tapping showcases in there as well. It was just so influential to me. And a few years later, I was able to get hold of one of these basses, which is a Kubicki X Factor bass, which is the kind of thing that Stuart used to use back in those old days. So just being able to play riffs like Black Ice, the opening track on Kings of Sleep, you know, with the drop D tuner. Stuff like that. That was just so influential to me back then. That track, and there was another one called Call of the Wild, which has a really wicked kind of slap part. That kind of thing. I've never forgotten those lines because I used to play them over and over again. It was just absolutely fantastic to work through the songs on that album. And as I said, I consider myself so fortunate to have discovered that book that day in Exeter. It's a very cool book. Okay, let's check out the next album. The third album that I want to mention here is this one. This is by a bass player called Randy Coven, and it's an album called Sammy Says Ouch. Randy Coven was another bass player that I discovered through a tuition video that he put out in the early 90s. I think I rented it from my local music shop again. And again, it was a massively influential video because he talked about a lot of technique stuff, a lot of slapping and tapping. I think he even did some double thumbing on there, although I certainly didn't understand that at the time. But he talked a lot about theory as well. He talked a lot about scales and arpeggios, and at that point I was beginning to realise that I was going to need to understand theory a little bit if I was going to have any sort of success as a bass player. So that was kind of interesting as well. I didn't learn a ton of songs off of this album. I think I learned there's a Charlie Parker cover on there called Au Prevave, and I think I learnt that. And then there's a tune on there called 10,000 Notes, which has a really wicked opening riff, which I think Randy demonstrated on the video, something like I can't believe I actually played that. I haven't played that in years, and it went into all that kind of stuff. I can't remember it now, but absolutely wicked. Real finger busting stuff. Used to keep me up at nights trying to sort of play that stuff up to tempo. So really influential album for me. I was so sad to see that Randy died a couple of years ago. I hadn't really followed his career for the last 10 or 15 years, so I never sort of kept up with what he released after that album. But a fantastic bass player, and I really recommend going back and checking out some of his stuff if you can. Back in the early 90s, at the same kind of time as I was discovering Stu Hamm and Randy Coven, I discovered Billy Sheehan, again through tuition videos that I got from my local music shop. I think there were two of these. There was one called Bass Secrets, which I think came out just after the first Mr. Big album was released, and then there was an older one that I forget the name of. But they were fantastic videos because it was basically Billy just breaking down his all of his techniques, his fantastic techniques, and the way he plays, and the way he thinks about the fingerboard and all that kind of stuff. Just absolutely fascinating. And then he dissected various songs as well. And there was a particular piece that he mentioned on one of the videos called NV43345. And I eventually tracked this down to an album that he released back in the early 80s with a band called Talus, which was the band that Billy was in. They supported Van Halen, and it kind of led him into the Dave Lee Roth band. And I eventually tracked down this album, which is called Sink Your Teeth Into That. And it's just absolutely fantastic. It's a rock album, but the bass playing is just absolutely extraordinary. It's a trio setting, which is always a great environment for a bass player because you get the freedom to play a little bit more, which you wouldn't have if there was a second guitarist or a keyboard player. Anyway, this piece, NV43345 from this album, it's a solo bass piece. I suspect most of it's improvised. I'm not entirely sure, but there was a particular section in the middle of it that was just so inspiring to me. It absolutely blew me away. And I remember Billy teaching it on the video. Basically this kind of thing. That kind of stuff. That whole thing of taking a chord and then tapping notes and pulling off onto that chord just absolutely blew me away, and I was absolutely obsessed with that piece of music for a number of years, and I spent a long time figuring out how to play that. Fortunately, there was a Billy Sheehan tab book out at the time. I think it was called the Talus Years, and it had transcriptions of a lot of the pieces from the Sink Your Teeth Into That album, and I think I learned most of the songs off of Sink Your Teeth. It's just an absolutely killer album, and NV43345 in particular, just an absolutely fantastic piece of music. Very influential to me. Billy's done tons and tons of great stuff throughout his career, and he remains a massive influence for me to this day. So be sure to check out what Billy does, and in particular maybe go back and check out that old Talus album because it is absolutely fantastic. 1993 was a big year for me as a bass player because a bunch of really important bass albums came out, and I discovered a few other great albums as well during that year. The first one that I want to talk about is the first Rage Against the Machine album, which I believe came out in 1993 without checking. I can't find my CD, God knows where that's gone. But I was absolutely blown away by this album, and I remember being at college at the time and driving around in my car with my friends just listening to this album just on repeat. We were all just blown away by Tim Comerford's bass playing, but also the guitar work as well, which was just so unusual. And those bass grooves, things like Bullet in the Head. All those tracks, Bomb Track, Killing in the Name, Know Your Enemy, all that kind of stuff. I absolutely loved it. And back then I was really getting into bass, and one of the things I've always been driven to do for some reason is to write transcriptions. And this was back in the days when I probably couldn't read music particularly well, although I think I was learning at this point. And I basically transcribed every single song on the first Rage album and learnt the album inside out, played every single note on it back to front, forward and backwards. Over and over again. So massive influence on me, and it's so cool to see that Rage is still a massive influence on young bass players now, and of course Tim Comerford is still as amazing as ever. So yeah, that first Rage album was a massive influence for me. Also in 1993 we had this one, which is the first Jamiroquai album, and this was just for me and for so many other people, this was just absolutely stunning when it first came out. And as a young bass player who's kind of getting into the funky stuff, I mean, what an album to be checking out. I remember learning, there's a tune on there called Whatever It Is, I Just Can't Stop, and I was just absolutely obsessed with that bass line. Such a great line, that tune, and there's another one called Blow Your Mind. That kind of thing. I think Blow Your Mind goes on for about 10 minutes, and I know I used to just sit there and play through it over and over again, obviously doing wonders for my fingerstyle technique, I guess. But again, that was another album that I think I transcribed every tune on it meticulously, or tried to at least. And again, I used to play through the entire album from back to front. What a thing to do. But yeah, what an inspirational album. Stuart Zender's playing on that album to this day, I think, is recognised as being some of the most influential bass playing of the last 30 years. And if you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend you check out that first Jamiroquai album. Next one I want to talk about is, of course, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I think this came out in 1993. I certainly discovered it in 1993 anyway. Again, this was just incredible. This is my first introduction to Flea, really, although I think I'd heard a few of his tunes previously, but not really been that taken with it. But I remember hearing this album and just being absolutely blown away. There was a particular tune on there called Mellowship Slinky in B major. It's incorrectly called, I think. And the bass line on it, this... I was just absolutely blown away by that tune, and there's another one on there called Apache Rose Peacock, which I can't remember how to play, but I know I absolutely love that song as well. And there's of course a Psycho Sexy, If You Have to Ask, Give It Away. There's just so much great stuff on that album, and again, I think I learnt the entire album and basically was playing that over and over again. The fourth album that I want to talk about that I discovered in 1993 is this one. This is an older album. This is the soundtrack for the Blues Brothers film. And the reason I discovered this was when I was doing my A-level in music, the college was putting on an annual musical, and we were doing the music from the Blues Brothers and the Commitments in a sort of combined show. And I'd never encountered the Blues Brothers before. And I remember getting hold of the soundtrack and sort of knowing that I needed to learn some of the songs. And I put it on, and the first thing I heard was the opening track, She Caught the Katy. And the bass playing just absolutely blew me away. It's Duck Dunn playing, old soul and R&B lines, but that whole sort of... all of that kind of stuff I just absolutely loved. And I remember figuring out that line and thinking, oh wow, that's a really unusual thing to do, to go from a root note up to the sixth and back to the fifth. And I was just, at the time, thought that was incredible. And of course, the more you learn about Duck's playing, you realise that was the kind of thing that he did a lot, and that's a very typical soul and R&B move. But at the time, that really stuck with me. And again, with that album, I learned every single track on it, and it was really educational for me because there's lots of walking bass on there, lots of blues lines, and of course, when you're studying and transcribing walking bass, you're learning about chord tones and arpeggios, and that went hand in hand with all of the music theory that I was learning at college at the time. So that was a hugely influential album. Anyway, I've covered 4 albums in this brief part of the video, and I think one of the really important things to say about these albums, something that I've noticed from being a teacher for the last 10 years, is the enduring popularity of all 4 of those albums. I mean, the Chili Peppers are still huge, Rage Against the Machine is still huge. I think they just announced a big reunion tour. Jamiroquai, of course, still going strong, still putting out great stuff. So all of these artists appear to have really stood the test of time, and it's been really great to meet young bass players, who certainly weren't even born when this stuff came out, who are discovering it now and finding it just as influential as I did. So 4 fantastic albums there for you to check out. As you learn to play the bass, it's very difficult to escape the name Jaco Pastorius, and certainly back in the mid-90s I was starting to realise that a lot of the bass players that I liked, like Mark King, Stuart Zender and Flea, whenever you read interviews with them, they were always talking about people like Jaco Pastorius. That was a name that seemed to come up quite a lot. And I'd never had the opportunity to listen to his music, because it just didn't seem to be something that I could ever find, where I lived. And it wasn't until I went to university that I really started to check out Jaco Pastorius, and that was courtesy of another bass player on the course who gave me some copies of his albums. And the most influential Jaco album for me, of course, is his first solo album, which came out in 1976, the year I was born, unbelievably. What an album. I mean, I was absolutely blown away by it. I certainly didn't understand what I was hearing initially. I mean, to hear Donna Lee being played, as a solo thing with congas, was just incredible. And that was one of the first times I'd heard a Charlie Parker tune, at all, and to hear it in that context was just absolutely mind-blowing. And I knew that what I was hearing was incredibly complex, and there was a lot of advanced harmony and things going on, but I certainly didn't understand it. And but it was incredibly influential. So things like that, and then all those fantastic R&B grooves on tunes like "Come On, Come Over" and "Kuru," and I loved that tune "Opus Pocus" with that minor second double stop that he plays in there, the third and the sharp 9 or flat 9 or whatever it is. Just absolutely blew me away, that kind of stuff. Things like that, and the harmonics in Portrait of Tracy. There's a particular group of 4 harmonics. Those ones that occur near the end of the piece. That sequence of 4 chords. I mean, that's something like you've never really heard things like that on the bass guitar, before. That kind of chord. There it is. That kind of harmonic chord, just absolutely incredible. What a thing to have come up with. That, and then the whole thing of the that D sharp harmonic that proved so difficult to get. There was just so much great stuff on that first Jaco album, and that led me, of course, into investigating Weather Report and checking out Jaco's that strange tuition video that he had from the mid-'80s with Jerry Gemot, which is kind of strange to watch, but there's tons and tons of great educational stuff in there as well, in terms of scales and arpeggios and his approaches to everything. So yeah, that was a massive album for me, but it came along relatively late for me, so I'd already been playing for about 5 years before I properly discovered Jaco. Another album that I simply have to mention is A Show of Hands by Victor Wooten. I think it was his first album. I think this came out back in 96 or 97, and I think I discovered it soon after. Incredibly influential for bass players all over the world. It stands still today as one of the best solo bass records of all time, I think. And I certainly know that when I heard it, I was just absolutely blown away, and I couldn't believe that a lot of what I was hearing was being played on one bass guitar with all the parts happening simultaneously. It just seemed absolutely impossible. I remember at the time, this was before we had all the great technology that we have these days, a friend of mine had some software where you could take a piece of music and slow it down but keep the pitch the same. It was very complicated and difficult to do, but I managed to get him to do a version of the album with everything slowed down massively with the pitch kept the same. And I remember using that as an aid to try and figure out some of the songs. I didn't actually get very far with a lot of it because it was so complex, but it was so important. And there's always a track that hooks you in on an album, isn't there? And for me, it was a track called Overjoyed, which is a solo bass cover of a Stevie Wonder song, and it had this all this kind of stuff, and it was just gorgeous. And I spent ages working on that and trying to figure out how to play it. And I had some success with that one and was able to get through most of that tune. That one was a massive influence for me. That one and the opening track, of course, You Can't Hold No Groove. That just absolutely incredible slap chops, and that got me thinking about the double thumbing thing and trying to figure out how to get that into my playing. Just so much great stuff on that album. Things like Classical Thump, Me and My Bass Guitar. There's a fantastic jazz medley on there as well. There's a track called More Love. I think basically the entire album is absolutely fantastic. It's not for everyone, I'm aware of that, because solo bass playing typically isn't, but I think it's one of the few bass albums that you can really sit and listen to as a complete statement, and it makes sense, and it feels like a really solid listen. It's something that I still enjoy to this day. So yeah, that was a massive album for me. Okay, so that's my list of the 10 albums that influenced me the most as a bass player. The list could go on and on, of course, and you're probably thinking, wow, you haven't mentioned Marcus Miller or Stanley Clarke or any number of other great bass players, and they are all important to me, but these 10 in particular just rose to the top and were the most influential to me as a bass player as I was learning. So do let me know in the comments below if you share the same influences, or if you have some other albums that you want to mention. I'll always be interested to hear what other people are into as well. And thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.